And so that just showed beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was done with the Jews because they wouldn't accept Jesus. And so if you have that kind of theology in your tradition and that kind of attitude in your tradition, when the Jews suffered the Holocaust, what are you going to draw from to say something positive? Other than, well, the temple was destroyed in 70, this is just the next shoe to drop, right? I mean, that actually would have been the more natural thing. Isn't this terrifying? The more natural thing for the church to say, based on its theological tradition, would definitely have been, what did you expect? Right? Thank God, and I mean that literally, thank God, that that's not what the churches did. But on the other hand, it took long time, it still is taking a long time, for the churches to rethink through, well, if that isn't what we wanted to say, which it wasn't, but that is what the church had said all along before that, what can we say now, right? What can we say that's theologically responsible, so you don't just want to make something up whole cloth, and on the other hand, that can really seriously address Christian anti-Judaism, right, which is the issue. And so, pardon me, I got to blow my nose. It's working me up.
I'll tell my quick story. Well,
yes.
I was at a gathering, a Memorial Day gathering on the porch where I live, and there's a very ardent Jewish man who's part of our crowd, and because I said what a beautiful lecture we had the Sunday before about the anti-Jewish attitudes and so forth, and told him about the document, I just had to make a copy of it for him, and I said, this is not an appropriate place for this conversation, but I can tell he was really interested.
Oh, good.
In what we've been doing.
Yeah.
About the Christian attitude toward the anti-Jewish.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, and thank you for that, because next week, I haven't decided yet. In one of the upcoming weeks, we'll look at the Jewish response to this, and part of the issue is the Jewish community has been very unsure how to respond, for good reason. If you have 1,800 years of tradition, and then suddenly the Roman Catholic Church does it literally a 180, which we saw last week, and it's a little, if you don't have hope, think about what happened in 1965. I mean, it is, with God, all things are possible. I truly believe it. That a church of 1.4 billion people, which said, understandably, we never teach anything new. We preserve the apostolic tradition as it was handed on to us through apostolic succession and the teaching of the magisterium and the Pope and all that. For them to, without saying they're doing it, completely contradict 1,800 years of tradition and go in a completely different direction, which they're still going in, by the way. They are by far the more sophisticated of any of the Christian communities on this issue. If you're Jewish, you're like, I'll believe it when I see it. And have they really repented? Right? And how far into the congregation's life is this going? So if it's the magisterium making these decisions, which are beautiful, how much do the people in the congregation, A, know them, and B, how much do they live them? So and also they're a teeny tiny community, the Jewish community, compared to the Christians. And we'll look at that probably next time. There's this wonderful Orthodox rabbi, Joseph Soloveitchik, who trained a whole generation of Orthodox rabbis who are working today. And he wrote an article in 1964, right before Vatican II came up, but he knew of all the dialogue that was going on, called Confrontation. And he's basically saying, we're not going to talk theology with Christians. We can talk about social things, but we're not talking theology, because there's this feeling, he calls it the community of the many in light of the community of the few. And there's this feeling that if you open the door to Christian good feeling, they'll just want to take over, right? Like the phenomenon, we'll talk about this a little bit, but the phenomenon of the Christian Seder, which if anyone ever invites you, don't go, and tell people not to do them. They're not as popular now, but the Christian Seder is a horrible idea. And so there are all sorts of ways people can think they're being friendly to Jews, but it actually winds up being insulting by appropriating their own traditions and making them your own. So there's this nervousness in the Jewish community about what can you trust this movement. But one of my colleagues, Rabbi Michael Signer at Notre Dame, who passed away many years ago, but he was involved in a group which we'll look at either next week or in a couple weeks, that finally said we need to say something, right? All these churches are coming out and making goodwill gestures toward us and changing their mind about this horrible teaching of contempt that had been handed on for years. The Jewish community needs to say something to acknowledge this, and also to make it known in the Jewish community itself that Christians have been doing this, right? Because he said the synagogues weren't even talking about it. But I understand why. You feel like you're a very small group surrounded by what Soloveitchik called the community of the many. So, but yeah, thank you for that outreach. That's wonderful. And it's something we need to do more consistently, I think. Yeah, yes?
I had a comment with that too, in terms of, I feel like from the Jewish perspective, often there's this feel like Christians are trying to evangelize
Right,
them
absolutely.
in these situations where there's this wariness there that they're just trying to push Jesus upon them
Yep.
when this dialogue
Yep.
happens.
No, and that's the other fear is the content. And look at what's happened in our society. We just read in the Mercy Seminar a document by Theodor Herzl, who's the founder of one version of Zionism, political Zionism. And one of the things he points out is he's talking about how anti-Semitism just won't go away. And he said, if you're in a country where anti-Semitism is in abeyance, just wait, right? It will erupt like unexpectedly and everywhere. And I think right now in the United States, we're in that moment. I mean, the Anti-Defamation League has told the story that in the last couple years, anti-Semitic incidents have gone up 900%, something like that. It's just outrageous. So it's always there and just waiting to erupt. So that's one side. And then the other side is Jews are aware, it's why don't you believe, one of the first questions Jews ever get asked if they're in a Christian context is, why don't you believe in Jesus? And so if that's the attitude, which they keep running into from Christians, which is a pressuring, you should believe in Jesus, you don't, why don't you? Rabbi Signer was asked that by a group of master's students when I was master's program director. And he said to them, well, do you believe Joseph Smith was a prophet? And they're like, who? These are all Roman Catholic students. He said, Joseph Smith. And they said, I've never thought about it. He said, I haven't either, in terms of Jesus, right? So it was very good, actually, because we're in America. Mormonism is an American tradition, and yet do you ever lose sleep? Maybe Joseph Smith is a prophet, Maybe I should read the Book of Mormon. I tried to read the Book of Mormon, by the way. I didn't get very far, so maybe that's on me. So anyway, yeah, that is definitely the other fear. And the Roman Catholic Church has yet to come out, and it's because it's a tricky thing. Is the mission to the Jews over? Seems to be, but so it's because they can't really say that if you're to go and make disciples of all nations, and Israel's one of the nations, and Israel is the nation to whom Jesus came first and really exclusively. How can you exempt Israel from the Christian mission? So there is a very strong pressure in Christianity to missionize everyone, and Jews know that. And the target that we'd love to win is the Jews, right? Because their disbelief threatens the credibility of the Christian message. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons there's so much hostility toward them right out of the gate. But yeah, that's a really good point. So that's the other avenue that they're afraid we're going to keep going down, is either the teaching of contempt and anti-Judaism will re-erupt, or we'll try to convert them, or in Luther's case, you'll try to convert them, they won't convert, and then anti-Judaism will erupt, right? So that Luther actually is an embodiment of how both things can go together. So you make a sincere effort to reach out in love and say, oh yes, all is forgiven, we repent, now will you believe? And they're like, oh God, here we go again. And they're like, absolutely not. And then, anti-Judaism flares out again. So it's a really complicated issue. And it's especially complicated, which is why I began, not chronologically, but thematically with the Lutheran Church. Because the Lutheran Church, the Holocaust happened in Germany. And one of the people Hitler quoted, it's important to say this, Luther did not give Hitler the idea to exterminate the Jewish people. Hitler was working with this very primitive social Darwin theory of race. and which is very modern, right? So it's post-evolutionary, in which the Jews are a distinct race, which is vastly inferior to the Aryan race, and they're polluting the Aryan race and need to be gotten rid of. And so that's not Luther, right? Luther did not have this kind of race theory. But when Luther was brought to his attention, because Luther is the German theologian, right? And the German reformer, when people pointed out to him what Luther said about the Jews, he loved it, right? And so at the Nuremberg rallies, for instance, they would bring out Luther's most infamous book, which we'll look at in a second, on the Jews and their lies. And he also wrote a thing on the divine names that was also quoted extensively. And so Luther's anti-Jewish writings were used by the Nazis to say, we always knew the Jews were garbage that needs to be incinerated, and Luther is just like our main voice pointing that out to the Christian community. So that coincidence in the Lutheran tradition is different than the overall anti-Jewish theology that you get in Christianity. Most of the things Luther says about the Jews, everyone else said about the Jews. So he gets singled out sometimes like he was exceptional. It wasn't what he said about the Jews that was exceptional, it's what he wanted to be done to the Jews that was exceptional, and we'll look at that. It did actually coincide with a lot of the Kristallnacht kind of behavior that was going on in Nazi Germany. So it took them, you can understand why, a long time to come to terms with the anti-Judaism in their own tradition, especially since it's rooted in Martin Luther, right, among others. And they did so, interestingly, through a 30-year dialogue that was initiated by the American Jewish Committee. There's American Jewish Council, too. I had to make sure I got the right one. The American Jewish Committee reached out, Mark Tannenbaum in particular, who was heading it up, reached out to Lutheran theologians, some of whom were at Gettysburg Seminary just down the way, Eric Rich, to enter into dialogue with their Jewish fellow scholars. It was a scholarly discussion. And that went on for 30 years, Lutheran and Jewish scholars studying together to see if they could get the Lutherans to change their position, basically. And so it took until 1994, but after a 30-year dialogue that went all around the country, it was very impressive, to come out with the statement we're looking at today. And you can tell even then they're really nervous about it. It's not like the Lutheran and Episcopal churches, the way they would come up with a statement is different than Rome, because you don't just have a council coming up with it, then the Pope promulgating it. You have the whole church voting on it, basically. And the Lutheran World Federation is an even larger organization beyond the ELCA in the United States. So it took a lot longer also just to get this discussed and voted on and approved. But they finally did come out with a statement that has been very warmly received by the Jewish community. So just looking at it, the Church Council of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America on April 18, 1994, adopted the following document as a statement on Lutheran-Jewish relations. There's only been one change in this document, and it occurred in 2021, and I'll tell you, it's in the very first sentence. In the long history of Christianity, there exists no more tragic development than the treatment accorded the Jewish people on the part of the Christian believers. The change that was made in 2021, in light of the protests of indigenous people, was the Holocaust was not the only horrible, tragic thing that happened in history. And so they changed it to among the most grievous and shameful legacies. So it's among the most. I personally think they should have pushed back harder, because this document is not talking about the Holocaust. It's talking about the way Christians have treated Jews for 2,000 years, right? And so they caved on it. I can understand why, but it isn't. The indigenous people of North America, the treatment was horrible, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't for 2,000 years. And we didn't single them out wherever they were in the world, right? And we don't have a whole theology about how awful and cursed the indigenous people are. So it was an unfortunate cave on my part, but I also can see why. If you're talking about the Holocaust, yes, it isn't the only horrible thing Christians have done, for sure. Slavery would be one of the others. Anyway, then it goes on to say, very few Christian communities of faith were able to escape the contagion of anti-Judaism and its modern successor, anti-Semitism. And they say anti-Semitism because of the race theory that lies behind it. The Semitic race is inferior, which is funny because Palestinians are Semitic, right? So if you're anti-Semitic, then you'd be anti-Palestinian as well as anti-Jewish. So I personally think anti-Jewish or anti-Judaism is better than anti-Semitism. But that anti-Semitism is what Herzl was talking about. It's the word that was thrown around Europe at the time. And so, but anti-Judaism is much more deeply seated in Christianity than anti-Semitism, just to put that out there. Some, like Luther, have both, right? They think that the Jews themselves are a contagion, like just as a race. In fact, there were Catholic theologians at the time of Hitler who were trying to warm up to Hitler, who claimed that the Jewish race is so sinful, not even baptism can redeem it, right? So Jews who are baptized are still fundamentally corrupt. That's how bad they are. So that's a combination then of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, because so they're distinct, but they often are related. So if you hear people say things about how the Jews as a people are just fundamentally corrupt, not morally, but just as a people, that's anti-Semitism for sure. Anti-Judaism is they denied Jesus, they rejected the prophets, they condemned our apostles, and God destroyed the temple. That's anti-Judaism. So they're related, but they can be distinct. Okay, Lutherans belonging to the Lutheran World Federation and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America feel a special burden in this regard because of certain elements in the legacy of the reformer Martin Luther and the catastrophes, including the Holocaust of the 20th century, suffered by Jews in places where Lutheran churches were strongly represented. And this is where the shoe really pinches, right, for them. The Lutheran communion of faith is linked by name and heritage to the memory of Martin Luther, teacher and reformer, honoring his name in our own, and so they're not trying to, like, what we would do today is we'd cancel the name, right? Isn't that? So we think we can eradicate our history by changing names. That is pathetic. And it's a complete illusion. So they didn't do that, thank God, right? They're like, we're gonna take this bitter pill, right? So we are linked with him, teacher and reformer, honoring his name in our own. So they're not gonna say, we have to change the name. We recall his bold stand for truth, his earthy, he was very earthy, and sublime words of wisdom, and above all, his witness to God's saving word. Luther proclaimed a gospel for people as we really are, bidding us to trust a grace sufficient to reach our deepest shames and address the most tragic truths. So you can see where they're going. So it's Luther who makes possible a reassessment of Luther, right? And a reassessment of us. That's what they're saying. But they're not saying, and this is we need to think about this, what we're doing now. What we would do now is get rid of Luther. Change the name of the church. It's offensive, right? And I've heard people say that. There's a stained glass window in Santee Chapel at Lancaster Seminary that has 3 images of Luther in it. It's a beautiful window. And a person who was applying for a job there came and said, you need to cover those over, right? Because Luther was anti-Jewish. It's like, well, so was everybody that's in these windows, so you're gonna have to black out the whole thing. But anyway, so you get that kind of cancellation, which I was very impressed they didn't do here. So they're saying, yes, we're named after Luther, but now we have to own what Luther said and also disown it in the name of Luther's theology, right? By means of what Luther said. We're all sinners, deeply in need of grace. We need to remember this more, I think. Because we think actually we can get rid of all the sinners. The room's going to be empty. But anyway, beginning with me. So anyway, so it allows them then, the gospel allows you to reach your deepest shames and address the most tragic truths, which if you're Lutheran, this is awful, right? I was on a plane once flying from South Bend to Toronto, and I was sitting next to this Polish-Jewish couple, wonderful people, and they were old enough to have been through the Holocaust. And so they were talking to me, we were, where are you going in Toronto, and blah, blah, blah. And they said, oh, you're going to the 16th Century Studies Conference? And I said, yeah. And they said, like Martin Luther's 16th century? And I said, yes. And they said, do you teach Luther? And I said, yes. And they go, do you make sure to tell them that Luther wrote on the Jews and their lies and what a dangerous, horrible, despicable work that is? I said, actually, yes, I do. But they're not theologians. They actually were part of, the story is really interesting. They grew up in Poland in a completely assimilated, completely secular Jewish home in Poland. And Poland had a very high number of Jewish people. And all of his friends were Christians, Catholics probably, in town. And the Nazis came, and there were no Jewish symbols in the home, no kippas, no nothing, right? And no kashrut, nothing. And he was a young teen when the Nazis came to town, and they rounded all the people up, and they got the kids in particular. And they said, "Are there any Jews here?" And all of his friends turned and pointed at him, right? And it was like, oh my God. I mean, you can't shed, this is Herzl's point, right? Everyone, you're just going to be herded into a group no matter what. You're always going to be a stranger. Everyone's going to know you're an outsider no matter what you try to do. And B, he just fled for the hills and became part of the resistance. And so he fought the Nazis as part of the Jewish resistance in Poland. It was a beautiful thing, actually. But that was the first thing he said to me. Make sure you teach the horrible things Martin Luther said about me and my people. He said, because the Nazi soldiers, and I don't know if this is true, I've never been able to find documentary evidence, he said that the handbook they had for the rules of engagement included quotes from Luther's treatises on the Jews and their lies and other writings from that period. So this is how seriously Luther is implicated in the Holocaust, right? It isn't that he caused it, but he was very handy in terms of the people carrying it out. So that story, it's always haunted me, yeah.
How about some of the other faiths? Baptists, Mormons, Methodists? What are their views?
Well, they haven't, I mean, the Baptists are tricky because they don't often come out with statements like this because they don't really have a procedure. And the one statement they did come out with about the inerrancy of Scripture divided the church. So the Baptists are renowned for, and should have stuck with, freedom of conscience, right? So you have no creed. You have freedom. You have no liturgy. You have freedom with regard to that too. The Spirit is supposed to govern everything. So the Baptists probably aren't going to come out with a statement this way because that's not what they usually do. The Methodists, I don't know. I have to look and see. I picked for today, I picked two statements that are pretty representative of like mainstream, main line in the Philadelphia sense of the word churches. So the Lutheran and Episcopal also, because we're just like right down the street from each other. But I would have to check to see what the Methodists say. But the Baptists, I don't think have said anything about this. Yes?
Oh, Baptists. Isn't it true that Baptists are the prisoners and the slaves?
The Baptists are the prisoners and the slaves?
Yes.
Where, in which context?
In context of being people in a civilization between the church and the state.
I mean, the Baptists were disenfranchised in England until the late 17th century, but I'm not familiar with them being.
Imprisoned and enslaved for that.
Oh yeah. Oh, they weren't alone, right? Okay. No, I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
Yep, they're the Baptists.
Yeah, and it gets even more ironic because a lot of the Quakers were killed also. I mean, there were people, so you're talking about England in particular. Yeah, the Baptists were very badly treated because they denied bishops and therefore you're denying the monarchy. And my wife was raised in the congregational tradition, and I once said to her, well, you know, no bishops, no king. And she looked at me and she said, no bishops?
That's why Jews deny Jesus. Or was that Christians that are denying Jesus?
Well, let me just finish the story for a sec. So I said, no bishops, no king. That's an old Anglican saying, right, in England. And she said as a congregation, no bishops, no king, no problem. So anyway, but that meant that the Congregationalists, that's why they came over here. The Baptists, same thing, came over here or to Amsterdam. The Quakers got it from everybody. In fact, her Congregationalist ancestors in New Jersey had a member of the family who was became a Quaker, and she was sold into slavery. So your question's a good one. One of the ways dissenting.
Jailers will be jailed. That's
Right.
Corinthian scripture. So who's jailing the Baptists and baptisms?
That's a good question. I mean, that sort of gets us off.
More of a statement. Jailers will be jailed. That's a will.
Okay, we're gonna have to bracket that because we're not really talking about the way Baptists were treated right now, but it's a good question.
Favor.
Pardon me?
We're talking about scripture. It's a return favor.
No, we're talking. Yeah, well, we're basically talking about is what churches have taught, maybe based in Scripture and maybe not. So,
Handcuffs will fall off.
That was the idea of Peter. But anyway, we got to get back to the text. So then the question becomes, if you do that, how do you then use Luther against Luther, basically, right? So how do you use Luther to steer the Lutheran Church in a different direction? And so they say, in the spirit of that truth-telling, we who bear his name and heritage must with pain acknowledge also Luther's anti-Judaic diatribes and the violent recommendations of his later writings against the Jews. And we'll look at those in a sec. That's at the bottom of the sheet. As did many of Luther's own companions in the 16th century, which is true, we reject this violent invective, and yet more do we express our deep and abiding sorrow over its tragic effects on subsequent generations. In concert with the Lutheran World Federation, we particularly deplore the appropriation of Luther's words by modern anti-Semites for the teaching of hatred toward Judaism or toward the Jewish people in our day. Now, what's interesting about that paragraph is the violent invective was unique to Luther, and luckily wasn't picked up by other people, including rulers, but the anti-Jewish theology of Luther was shared by everybody, including Desiderius Erasmus, who's usually seen as a good humanist guy. He was deeply anti-Jewish, deeply. Voltaire, later on, this great Enlightenment figure, deeply anti-Jewish. So it's not, to me, they're renouncing Luther's anti-Jewish vindictiveness, which is good, against the Jews in their lives, but they're not really engaging the issue the Vatican II engaged, which is the theology of the Jews being rejected. Not what we should do in light of them, which thankfully they say we shouldn't have followed Luther, and the Nazis did publish these things, but what we said about the Jews is much broader than that, and it was shared by everybody in the 16th century, pretty much. So it's interesting that they parse that out. So if you look at why would I say that? Well, if you look at the very bottom paragraph, these are selections from Luther's proposals at the end of this treatise, very long one, called On the Jews and Their Lies, which he published late in his life, in which he's telling rulers what to do about the Jews living in their midst, right? And so he says, what shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Okay, that the Jews are rejected and condemned, everybody taught. Everybody taught, from Justin Martyr through right up to Vatican II. So that's not new, right? I just want to say that. Since they live among us, we dare not tolerate their conduct now that we are aware of their lying and reviling and blaspheming. If we do, we become sharers in their lies, cursing, and blasphemy. First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools, and to bury and cover with dirt whatever will not burn, so that no man will ever again see a stone or cinder of them. You can imagine Kristallnacht would just be like, oh, hey, Luther said we should do this, right? Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught be taken from them, which would end the rabbinic leadership of the Jewish community, which was precisely his point, right? Fourth, I advise that the rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for Jews, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg, what he recommended. But burn the synagogues, bury the books, take all the Talmud and other writings away from them, forbid the rabbis to preach under penalty of loss of limb or death, and then remove safe conduct on the highways. And these were dangerous times in which to travel. So those are the things that they're talking about, the violent recommendations. And luckily, as I said, no ruler in the 16th century did any of these things. They all thought Luther was off his rocker, and even his fellow theologians disowned him for that. So the most influential book that Luther wrote on the Jews was called Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew, which was a 1523 work. This is 20 years later. And so it's not without its own anti-Jewish elements, but it has nothing like this in it. So that's the kind of thing that they're coming to terms with. Yeah, Seta.
Is that the reason why to condemn the giant body of Christian believers, did not stop Hitler? That Luther or the Lutheran Church simply did not have a mission of stopping Hitler's Jew.
Right, right. Though it didn't, so to be clear, Roman Catholic Church, first the Roman Catholic Church was completely silent about the Holocaust while it was going on and they knew about it, right? That's why Vatican II responds the way it does, because we were complicit by our silence. The churches in Germany, there was a confessing church which broke from the state-sponsored Lutheran church, but it was like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you probably heard of him, and others. Actually, Rudolf Bultmann was a member of that too. I didn't know that till his daughter told me, but there were theologians, Karl Barth would be another one, who broke with the territorial churches in Germany because they seemed to be supporting Hitler or weren't doing enough against Hitler. But they did not, even Bonhoeffer said this, before he died young, as you know, and he died in the failed attempt to assassinate Hitler. But he said the one issue we never dealt with was the Jews, right? They dealt with the ordination of Jews who had become Christian, and they were being excluded from churches by the Nazis. They were worried about that, but they weren't worried about Jews qua Jews, which is really interesting. So even Bonhoeffer said we didn't do right by that. There's a church in Barmen-Wuppertal in Germany, where I don't know if you know this, but there's a very influential document called the Barmen Declaration that was written by the confessing church of Lutheran and Reformed theologians to protest what Hitler was doing and the German Christians were doing. And it has 5 articles, none of which mention Kristallnacht or the Holocaust or anything. And there's a church, the church in Barmen, which was where Barth wrote that declaration, has subsequently admitted Russian Jews who emigrated to Germany. There are almost no German Jews left. I mean, the Holocaust just like annihilated them. But there are Jews in Germany now, but they're mainly from Russia. And the Russian Jews moved to Barmen, but they didn't have a synagogue. And so the church in Barmen built a synagogue on their property for them. And they called it the 6th article of the Barmen Declaration. Like, this is what we failed to do. And then a lot of anti-Jewish activity arose in Germany during that time. This is about 20 years ago. And so they wanted to put a complete barbed wire topped fence around the synagogue to protect it. And the Barmen church said, you're not going to do that, you're going to do the whole property. So they fenced the whole property in solidarity with the synagogue. So there's an acknowledgement that the churches did not address this question at the time. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to wait till 1994 to find a Lutheran document on this, and 1965 for the Roman Catholic Church to say something. So you're absolutely right. What the reason for that, I think, is that the theological resources of the Christian tradition did not provide anything that you could immediately find to say something different about the Jews than this, right? Because from the very beginning, the Jews, I mean, we looked at those quotes, they're just appalling. Justin Martyr says the reason there's circumcision is so that the Jews can be singled out and shown to be uniquely punished in all the world, that they suffer what they justly suffer and no one else is going to suffer that. And Origen says the same thing. God has abandoned them. There are no signs of divinity among them, no grace at work within them. So if that's your tradition, and you turn to your tradition to say, what should we say about the treatment of the Jews today? It's like, they're getting what's due them, right? That's what you'd say, and it's like, you don't want to say that. But, you know, there's another story, and it's in the New Testament, right? We have this problem in the New Testament itself. There was a woman interviewed in the TV series The Shoah, a Polish woman, because Poland was really like, it's the nastiest place of the whole thing, because the Jewish community was the largest in Poland. And there's this wonderful woman, the Jews would call her a righteous Gentile. She risked her life to save Jews in her house. She hid them in her house and worked with others to save Jews, right? And she's Roman Catholic. But just amazing. It was like self-evident to her that you should do that. And so they were telling her story and interviewing her. And finally the interviewer said, which is a really interesting question, you know, given all these years since and your complete involvement in this and you're risking your life for these people, why do you think this happened to them? And she said, well, you know, they did cry out in the Gospel of Matthew, his blood be on us and our children. So I guess that's why this happened, right? So our New Testament will provide you reasons to say you get what's coming to you, right? You denied Jesus, God's denied you, you're going to suffer through history, and now this suffering is just more intense, but it's the same thing. So the New Testament, unfortunately, is loaded with texts that the anti-Jewish theologians used against the Jews. So this is the problem, actually. We're up to our neck in it. Maybe it's above our heads. And it's going to take a very long time to figure out how to get out from under it, because it isn't, and they were using Old Testament texts like the prophecy in Isaiah about Jerusalem being burnt down to nothing but a cucumber hut, or a hut in a cucumber field, and strangers will come and eat your produce. That's a line that was quoted by all these anti-Jewish authors throughout Christian history. So it's that part of your question is a really good one, and part of the issue was theologically they couldn't figure out what to say at all. And as John Connolly said about Vatican II, if it weren't for Paul's statement, they are enemies of the gospel for your sake, but they are beloved of God for the sake of their fathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. John Connolly said, and I think he's right, if it weren't for that one verse, the Roman Catholic Church would have had nothing to say to the Jews after the Holocaust. So when it comes down to one verse, we're in trouble, right? We're in trouble. On the other hand, why did this woman help the Jews? It wasn't influenced by theology. People initially thought, well, it was the Reformed tradition in particular, because they have a very exalted view of Israel in their theology in the Old Testament and all that. That's not true. Roman Catholics, atheists, Lutherans, Reformed, whatever, do you know why they helped Jews during the Holocaust? They saw them as human beings. That's it. It's right there. If you see the other person as a human being, you'll help. If you don't, you won't. And it doesn't matter what theology you have. You could have a totally pro-Israel, pro-Jew theology, but if you see that suffering Jew and his life or her life's in danger, and you don't see them as a fellow human being, you won't help. So that's a really interesting thing. This problem actually is deeper than theology, but it's been certainly accentuated by theology and Scripture. So it's a really deep problem, though. And your question's a good one. Why were the churches silent, and why did it take them 50 years to say something? Because there aren't resources in our tradition to say something. So anyway, the capstone is then their final statement. Grieving the complicity of our own tradition within this history of hatred, moreover, I don't think that they realize, though, that the history of hatred goes, this is one reason I wanted to do this forum. The history of hatred goes all the way back and is in every single Christian tradition I've looked at. Persian, Syriac, Greek, Latin, Protestant, Catholic. I mean, it's just everywhere. So, and it's because they're using New Testament texts to support it, and the destruction of the temple. Anyway, grieving the complicity of our own tradition with this history of hatred, which is wider than the Lutherans. Moreover, we express our urgent desire to live out our faith in Jesus Christ with love and respect for the Jewish people. We recognize in anti-Semitism a contradiction and an affront to the gospel. I don't know why they didn't include anti-Judaism, but anyway, a violation of our hope and calling, and we pledge this church to oppose the deadly working of such bigotry, both within our own circles and in the society around us. Finally, we pray for the continued blessing of the Blessed One upon the increasing cooperation and understanding between Lutheran Christians and the Jewish community. So I think the key line is our urgent desire to live out our faith in Jesus Christ with love and respect for the Jewish people, and anti-Semitism is a contradiction and an affront to the gospel, right? But I agree, but they don't demonstrate, this is just me, they don't demonstrate why it's a contradiction of the gospel, right? Because I can cite gospel texts that will show that it's not a contradiction of the gospel. So, and in fact, the Roman Catholic Church decided the only text they could find to show that it was an affront to the gospel was Romans 11:28, right? And that was about it. And then they find other texts that go with that, but without Romans 11:28, which shows that the Jews are beloved of God in spite of the fact they don't believe in Jesus and oppose the preaching of the gospel, you're just not going to get there. But I like the sentiment, but I just wonder why they had 30 years to study Nostra Aetate, and they don't use any of the theological depth that I saw in Nostra Aetate. But still, the Jewish community has been very warmly receptive of this move on the part of the Lutherans, and it has, in fact, I mean, it's been an amazing thing, because it's one thing for the Roman Catholic Church, which is pretty impressive, to do a 180 with all those years of tradition lying behind them, but for the Lutheran Church to admit how Luther was used by the Nazis, which was awful. If you don't believe me, just Google Martin Luther and the Nazis, right? They loved these late writings, and they used it to show, see, we always knew that the Jews were a problem. We have to get rid of them. So the Lutherans in particular had a really heavy lift in terms of, Tim, yeah, do you have a question?
It's interesting, Luther, you read that what he wrote, he says, well, were you having a bad day or something, right? Something like that. But it then entered into the political life all across the world. As a pain in the rear end teenager, I confronted my parents at one time after a Christmas or a Sunday afternoon dinner, and I said, why didn't anybody do anything? And my mom tried to placate me a little bit, saying, well, Timmy, you have to understand, we were getting sketchy information through the Red Cross and this and that, and you know, who would believe such a thing? My dad puts his newspaper down and he looks at me and he says, do you want to know the truth? I said, yeah. He said, they were just Jews.
Yeah.
And he let it sink in as my jaw hit the table. He said, nobody cared. The French didn't care, the British didn't care, the Poles didn't care, the Russians didn't care, the British didn't care, and by the way, the United States didn't care.
No, we didn't care at all.
The ship St. Louis came into the New York harbor filled with primarily Jewish refugees, and they turned the ship around, never to be heard from again.
Yeah, and it was denied. It was denied a port.
Cared.
Right, and that ship was denied a port everywhere it went.
Yep.
Right, but it was turned away in New York Harbor.
Yep.
And Roosevelt knew about it, by the way, and gave the order for it not to be admitted here. No, your point is, I mean, they were just Jews. That's exactly why, and so the attitude was both theologically anti-Jewish and racially, just anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. The other thing that is the untold story of the final solution, which is a horrible event in human history, but needs to be told, is Hitler wanted to get rid of the Jews. First, by getting them out of German-occupied territory, and no one would take them, right? No one, including the United States, right? We could have had a huge influx of Jews from Central and Western Europe come to the United States and save their lives, and we wouldn't take them. And so he said, well, nobody wants this garbage, so all you have to do is incinerate it, right? Which is literally what they did. And then they invented, because the soldiers had a very hard time shooting people when they could see their faces, because they would just line people up and dig a huge pit and then have them stand on a board above the pit and then mow them down with machine guns. And the soldiers were so traumatized by doing this, even though they're just Jews, that they couldn't do it anymore. So that's when they invented the industrialization of murder, where they packed them up like cows, shipped them off in cattle cars to camps where no one could see in, gas them, which you don't have to face-to-face kill them then, and then incinerated them, right? They just made them disappear into smoke because nobody else would take them. The British, who had control over Palestine during that time, limited Jewish immigration to Palestine to 5,000 a year during the Holocaust. I mean, it's way above our heads in terms of how implicated we are in this, both Christianly and nationally, and nationally in terms of the enlightened countries of the world. So no, thank you for that. And your father's answer is exactly right. By the time they did here, well, it's just Jews. Yeah. What do you expect? On the other hand, I was just reading about this in terms of, because we're doing the history of Zionism in the Mercy Seminar. Jews around the world could not believe the reports that were coming out, right? So it wasn't just Christians or Gentiles it was like, no way. They're not building camps and gassing people to death and incinerating them by the millions. There's no way. And then when they finally, and it was the Soviet troops actually who broke the news. They were the first ones to enter the camps. They were just horrified. The pictures coming out of the death camps, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, all of those, stunned everyone, including the Jewish community. And Zionism took off like a rocket after that because they couldn't believe that that's actually what happened. So it's that kind of news, no one, and now people are saying, no, it didn't happen.
Still deny it.
Yeah, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. I would say, though, and I've said this before, we never got to the Episcopal Church, but that's okay, it's good. People think, I used to think when I was younger, if you just taught the Holocaust, this would end anti-Judaism, and I don't think that way anymore at all. I don't think it works, because it makes, I mean, if you think about it, it makes Jews innocent victims of other people's violence, and they don't have any agency then. You're just viewing them as either survivors of victimization or potential victims. And that's true. I mean, that's not a bad thing to keep in mind. But overcoming anti-Judaism by teaching the Holocaust, I don't think it works, because you're not engaging living Jews and their own tradition way of seeing things, including people, a lot of Jews aren't religious at all, right? So there you get all sorts of stereotypes coming out of that as well. So anyway, but that I want to thank Tim, although he's already gone, for that story, because that really was, Izetta's question was a really good one. And I think the reason nothing was done is even when they heard what was being done, it's just Jews. And if the solution to it was allowing them to emigrate in great numbers to our country, nobody wanted that, right? Nobody wanted that. And the British didn't even want them to emigrate to Palestine in great numbers. It's really appalling. And so the Jews who did make it to Palestine during that time, if you ever saw the movie Exodus, I remember, this land is mine, God gave this land. That was the theme song. Anyway, my brother sang it all the time. He loved that song. But Exodus was about smuggling Jews out of Germany and Europe away from the Holocaust to Palestine against the British will, right? So the British would actually sink or block ships that were coming that way. So it's really, really bad. And we're all, up to our neck in implication with it. So anyway, on that happy note, well, I'll try to pick up on the guidelines for Christian-Jewish relations in the Episcopal Church next time when we then talk about the Jewish response. So next week we'll actually look at the beginning of the Jewish response to these overtures. So thank you again.